Imagine you're holding a small stone in your hand. At first it feels almost weightless. You barely register it. Your fingers curl around it naturally, and you go about your day without thinking twice. You can talk to people, check your phone, eat, laugh. Nothing feels different. The stone exists, but it doesn't interfere with anything. Now imagine you make a strange decision, you never put it down. You keep holding it while you walk, while you sit, while you work. You adjust your grip when it gets uncomfortable, but you never fully release it. At night, you fall asleep with it still in your hand. Maybe you switch hands occasionally, but the rule remains, you don't let go. A day passes, then a week, then months. At some point, something subtle begins to change. Your hand starts to feel tired more often, not dramatically, just a quiet, dull fatigue. Your fingers feel slightly stiff when you open them. You don't panic, you adapt. Humans are very good at adapting to small discomforts. Years pass. Now the change is no longer just a feeling, it's physical. The muscles in your hand have adjusted to a constant state of tension. The way you hold things becomes slightly different. Your grip is no longer natural, it's shaped by the long habit of holding that stone. Maybe your wrist aches sometimes. Maybe you don't even notice anymore because it has become your normal. Here's the strange part: the stone hasn't changed. It didn't grow heavier. It didn't become sharper. It didn't actively do anything to you. But your hand did. This is the key idea. A grudge works in a very similar way. It often begins as something small in terms of physical weight. It's just a memory, a thought, a story you tell yourself about something that happened. At the beginning, it doesn't seem powerful enough to shape your body or your biology. It feels like something contained inside your mind, but the mistake we make is assuming that something mental stays mental. It doesn't. Every thought you have is tied to physical processes. Tiny electrical signals move through networks of neurons. Chemical messengers are released. Hormones shift in concentration. Your body responds even if the response is too small to notice in the moment. Holding a grudge is not a single thought. It's a repeated pattern of thought. It's picking up the same stone again and again, often without realizing you're doing it. You replay a conversation. You imagine what you should have said. You feel a brief surge of anger or tension. Then the moment passes, and you move on until the next time. Each replay seems insignificant. Each one feels like just a few seconds of mental activity, but just like holding the stone. The effect is not in any single moment. It's in the accumulation. What makes this difficult to understand is that there's no clear turning point. There isn't a day where you wake up and say, "Today, the stone damaged my hand." The process is too gradual for that. It blends into the background of your life. And because of that, you stop questioning it. You start to treat the tension as normal. You forget what it felt like not to carry it. The absence of discomfort becomes unfamiliar, almost theoretical. So when we ask what a grudge does over 20 years, we shouldn't imagine something dramatic happening all at once. We should imagine something quiet, repetitive, and persistent, something that slowly shapes the system it exists within, not by force, but by never letting go. Your brain understands stories in a way that feels natural and automatic. It builds narratives out of everything: who said what it meant, why it mattered, and how it connects to your past. When something painful happens, the brain doesn't just store the event. It wraps it in meaning. It creates a structure around it. This was unfair. This should not have happened. This person caused it. That structure is useful in some ways. It helps you make sense of the world. It helps you avoid similar situations in the future. But there is a quiet mismatch between how the brain organizes experience and how the body responds to it. The body does not understand stories. It does not care about fairness, intention, or context. It doesn't distinguish very well between something that is happening right now and something that is being vividly remembered. What it responds to are signals, patterns of electrical activity, and chemical release that move through the nervous system. When you recall a painful memory, especially one tied to a grudge, the brain can recreate part of the original pattern. Not perfectly, not at full intensity, but enough to trigger a response. Stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline may rise slightly. Your heart rate can shift. Muscles might tighten in subtle ways, especially around the jaw, shoulders, or chest. If you were to measure these changes in a lab, they might look small, almost trivial. A slight increase here, a mild activation there. But small does not mean irrelevant. The important detail is repetition. Each time the memory is replayed, the body receives a signal. It doesn't log it as past or imagined. It logs it as activity, as something that requires adjustment. And so it adjusts over and over again. Think of it like a fire alarm system in a building. If the alarm goes off once, people respond, then reset, and everything returns to normal. But if the alarm goes off randomly every day, even at low volume, the system begins to change how it operates. People become tense. They remain slightly alert, even when things are quiet. The baseline shifts. Now imagine that instead of a building, the system is your body, and instead of an external alarm, the trigger is internal, a memory that can activate at any time. Over years, this repeated activation can create a kind of background state, not full stress, not panic, but a slightly elevated level of readiness. The body becomes practiced at responding in this way, just as your hand became practiced at holding the stone. What makes this even more subtle is that the brain can trigger these responses without conscious permission. You might not decide to revisit the memory. It might surface automatically while you're driving, lying in bed, or having a quiet moment. The reaction begins before you've had time to analyze it. This creates a loop. The memory triggers a physical response. The physical response reinforces the emotional tone of the memory. That emotional tone makes the memory more likely to return, round and round. From the outside, nothing dramatic is happening. You're just sitting there, thinking. But from the inside, signals are being sent repeatedly through a complex biological system. Hormones are being released and cleared. Neural pathways are being activated and strengthened. Tiny adjustments are being made in how the body regulates itself. And because each individual moment is small, it feels harmless. It's easy to say, it's just a thought. But in physical terms, a thought is not just anything. It is an event, an actual pattern of activity in the brain that has consequences for the rest of the body. Over 20 years, those consequences don't stay isolated. They accumulate, overlap, and interact with other processes. They become part of the environment your body lives in, not an external environment like weather or temperature, an internal one. And the body, quietly and continuously, adapts to whatever environment it experiences the most. Now we move one layer deeper, into a place that sounds abstract, but is actually very physical, your DNA. People often imagine DNA as something fixed, like a permanent instruction manual written at the beginning of life. The common picture is that your genes decide everything, and the rest is just details. But that picture is incomplete. A better way to think about DNA is not as a rigid script, but as a vast library. Inside this library are thousands of books, each representing different instructions your body could use: how to build proteins, how to regulate inflammation, how to repair damage, how to respond to threats. But here's the key point. Not all of these books are being read at the same time. Some are open and active. Others are closed and quiet. So the important question is not just what's in the library, but which parts of it are being used. This is where things get interesting. Your body has systems that decide which genes are turned on or off, or somewhere in between. These systems respond to signals, chemical signals, hormonal signals, environmental signals, and among those signals are the ones generated by your own internal states, including stress. There's a field of science that studies this process called epigenetics. The word literally means on top of genetics. It refers to changes in how your genes are expressed without changing the underlying DNA sequence itself. Think of it like this: the words in a book don't change, but someone goes through with sticky notes and highlighters. Some pages get marked, read this often. Others get tagged, skip this section. Some passages get dimmed, others emphasized. Over time, the way the book is used becomes very different, even though the text itself is identical. In your cells, one of the ways this happens is through tiny chemical tags, such as methyl groups, attaching to parts of your DNA or the proteins around it. This process is often called DNA methylation. These tags influence how easy or difficult it is for certain genes to be activated. Now connect this back to the idea of repeated stress. When your body experiences stress, whether from a real external event or a vividly recalled memory, it releases signals. Hormones circulate, cells respond, and over long periods, these repeated signals can influence the epigenetic markers that regulate gene activity, not in a simple one-to-one way, but in patterns. For example, genes involved in inflammation might become more active under chronic stress conditions. Systems related to immune response might shift their behavior. Processes involved in repair and recovery might be adjusted. It's not that a single grudge reaches into your DNA and flips a switch. It's that the repeated activation of certain internal states creates a pattern of signals, and those signals, over time, can leave marks on how your biological systems operate. This is subtle, and it's important not to exaggerate it. Your body is not fragile. It is incredibly dynamic and resilient. Epigenetic changes can sometimes be reversible. They can shift in response to new environments, new behaviors, new conditions, but they are also not meaningless. They represent a kind of memory, not a conscious memory like a thought, but a biological memory of what your system has been experiencing repeatedly. So when you think about holding a grudge for 20 years, you're not just talking about a persistent idea in the mind. You're talking about a long-term pattern of signals moving through a living system. And that system, at the level of gene expression, is always listening, always adjusting, and quietly reorganizing itself based on what it encounters most often, not dramatically, but continuously. At this point, it becomes important to slow down and separate what sounds convincing from what is actually supported by evidence. It's very easy to take an idea like this and stretch it too far, to imagine that a single emotional pattern directly rewrites your biology in a precise, predictable way. That would make the story clean and satisfying, but reality is not that clean. Science does not say that holding a grudge directly damages your DNA in the way a chemical toxin or radiation might. There is no clear mechanism where a specific memory reaches into your genetic code and alters its sequence. Your DNA, in that sense, is remarkably stable. What science does say is more subtle and in some ways more interesting. Long-term psychological stress, especially when it becomes a repeated, chronic pattern, is associated with a range of measurable biological changes. These are not guesses or metaphors. They are observed patterns across many studies. People who experience ongoing stress often show higher levels of baseline inflammation. Their immune systems behave differently. Certain regulatory systems in the body become slightly shifted from their usual balance. One of the most studied aspects of this is how stress interacts with the body's inflammatory response. Inflammation is not inherently bad. It is part of how your body heals and defends itself. But like many systems, it works best within a certain range. Too little, and you become vulnerable to infection. Too much, and it begins to create wear and tear across tissues. Chronic stress appears to push this system slightly toward the always-on side. Not dramatically, not like in an acute illness, but persistently. Another area researchers often examine involves structures called telomeres. Telomeres sit at the ends of your chromosomes, and they serve a protective role, a bit like the plastic tips at the end of shoelaces that prevent fraying. Every time a cell divides, these telomeres shorten slightly. Over time, as they become shorter, cells lose some of their ability to divide and function effectively. This process is a normal part of aging. However, studies have found correlations between chronic stress and faster telomere shortening. Again, this is not a simple cause and effect story. It doesn't mean stress alone determines how quickly you age at a cellular level. Many factors are involved: genetics, lifestyle, environment, random variation. But the pattern appears often enough to take seriously. Now bring this back to the idea of a grudge. A grudge by itself is not a measurable biological variable. You can't draw blood and detect grudge levels, but what can be measured is the pattern of stress responses that may accompany it, how often the body enters a mild state of activation, how quickly it returns to baseline, how frequently certain hormonal systems are triggered. If holding a grudge leads to repeated activation of stress pathways, even at a low level, then physiologically it begins to resemble what scientists call a chronic stressor. And the body does not categorize stress based on whether it comes from an external event or an internal memory. It responds to the signals it receives. Over long periods, this can influence immune regulation, inflammatory balance, and cellular processes like those involving telomeres. It can also interact with the epigenetic mechanisms discussed earlier, subtly shifting which genes are more or less active. But it's important to resist the temptation to turn this into a simple moral equation. This emotion causes this damage. Biology doesn't work like that. These are probabilistic effects, not guarantees. They vary from person to person. Some individuals carry heavy emotional burdens and show minimal measurable impact in certain areas. Others are more sensitive to stress and show changes more readily. Human systems are complex, layered, and influenced by countless variables interacting at once. So the most accurate way to think about it is not in terms of direct damage, but in terms of influence. A long-held pattern of stress, whatever its source, can become part of the environment your body is adapting to. And over years, that environment matters. There is a particular limitation in human thinking that quietly shapes how we understand cause and effect. It's not a flaw in intelligence, it's more like a built-in shortcut. The mind is very good at spotting clear, immediate relationships between actions and outcomes. If you touch something hot and feel pain instantly, the connection is obvious. The cause and the effect are close together in time, and the system learns quickly. But when causes are slow, distributed, and stretched over years, the mind struggles, not because the connection isn't there, but because it doesn't fit the pattern we're used to recognizing. A grudge does not operate like a hot surface. It doesn't produce a sharp, undeniable signal in a single moment. Instead, it produces a series of very small signals spread across thousands of moments. Each one by itself is too minor to demand attention. There is no clear event to point to. This creates a kind of invisibility. Imagine trying to notice the growth of a tree by watching it continuously for an hour. You would see nothing. Even if you watched it for an entire day, it would appear unchanged. Growth is happening, but it's occurring on a time scale that doesn't match your perception. Now imagine leaving and returning after 10 years. The change is undeniable. The tree is taller, thicker, structurally different. But you still can't identify the exact moment when that change occurred. There is no single instant where you can say, that was it. That's when the tree grew. The same logic applies to slow biological and psychological processes. When someone holds a grudge, there isn't a clear before and after transformation you can observe in real time. There's no single day where the body shifts in a dramatic way. Instead, there are countless small adjustments, slight increases in stress signaling, small shifts in hormone levels, minor changes in neural activity. Each one is too small to feel significant, but over years, these small effects accumulate. This is where an idea from physics becomes useful. Even if we don't write it as an equation, systems respond not just to the size of forces, but to how often those forces are applied. A tiny force repeated enough times can produce a large change. This is why metal can fatigue and break under repeated stress, even if no single stress was strong enough to cause damage. In the human body, the same principle applies, but in a more complex way. Instead of metal bending or cracking, you have regulatory systems adjusting their set points. What counts as normal begins to shift. For example, if your body experiences mild stress activation frequently, it may begin to treat that level of activation as part of its baseline. Not consciously, but physiologically, hormonal systems may recalibrate. Neural pathways associated with certain emotional responses may become easier to activate. Over time, the system becomes more practiced at being in that state. What makes this difficult to notice is that adaptation feels like normality from the inside. You don't experience it as a change. You experience it as the way things are. The new baseline replaces the old one without announcing itself. This is why people often underestimate the impact of long-term patterns. There is no clear signal telling them that something has shifted. There is only the absence of contrast. If you've been holding a certain pattern of thought and response for many years, you don't have easy access to what it felt like before. The earlier state fades from memory, and the current state becomes the reference point. So when we ask what a grudge does over 20 years, the difficulty is not just in measuring the effect, it's in perceiving it at all. Because the change does not happen in a way that the human mind is naturally designed to detect. It happens slowly, quietly, and continuously beneath the threshold where individual moments feel important, but above the threshold where long-term structure is being shaped. There is another layer to this that becomes visible when you stop thinking of the brain as a simple recorder of events and start thinking of it as something more active, something that is constantly trying to anticipate what will happen next. Modern neuroscience increasingly describes the brain as a kind of prediction system. It doesn't just wait for reality to arrive and then react. Instead, it builds internal models and continuously generates expectations about the world. It asks in a very quiet and automatic way, what is likely to happen next based on everything I've seen before? These predictions are not philosophical. They are physical patterns of activity. Networks of neurons preparing certain responses, biases forming in perception, attention being guided in particular directions. Now consider what happens when a person holds a grudge for a long time. The original event becomes more than a memory. It becomes part of the data the brain uses to build its model of the world. If the memory carries a strong emotional weight, it may be given more importance than neutral experiences. The brain may treat it as a useful reference point, something worth remembering in order to avoid future harm. But this introduces a subtle shift if the brain repeatedly revisits an experience of betrayal, unfairness, or harm. It may begin to slightly adjust its expectations, not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in small biases. It may become a little more sensitive to similar patterns. It may interpret ambiguous situations more cautiously. It may prepare defensive responses a bit more quickly. This is not necessarily irrational. In many cases, it is an attempt to protect. The problem is not that the system learns. The problem is how much weight it gives to a particular type of experience and how often that experience is replayed internally. Imagine a compass that is off by just 1 degree. If you take a single step, the error is invisible. Even after a few steps, it doesn't matter. But if you keep walking in that direction for a long distance, that tiny error becomes significant. You end up somewhere very different from where you intended to go. In the same way, small predictive biases in the brain, repeated over many years, can gradually influence how a person perceives and interacts with the world. Situations that are neutral might feel slightly tense. Interactions that are ambiguous might be interpreted more negatively. The body may prepare for stress responses more quickly, even when the situation does not fully justify it. And each time this happens, it reinforces the underlying model. The prediction leads to a response. The response shapes the experience. The experience feeds back into the prediction. This creates a loop that is self-stabilizing. From the inside, it feels like reality. It doesn't feel like a bias or a distortion. It feels like an accurate reading of the world. That's what makes it powerful. At the biological level, this loop is not just abstract. Neural pathways that are used more frequently tend to become more efficient. Connections between certain groups of neurons strengthen with repeated activation. This is often summarized by the phrase, neurons that fire together wire together, though the actual process is more complex. Over long periods, patterns of thought and reaction can become easier to trigger and harder to change, not because they are consciously chosen, but because they have been physically reinforced through repetition. So a long-held grudge is not just a static memory sitting somewhere in the mind. It can become part of an active system, a pattern that shapes predictions, influences perception, and prepares the body for certain kinds of responses. And because all of this happens gradually, without a clear boundary or moment of change, it often goes unnoticed. The person does not feel like they are carrying something from the past. It feels as though they are simply responding to the present. But the present they are responding to has already been filtered, shaped, and slightly redirected by patterns that have been repeating for years. At this point, it becomes necessary to admit something uncomfortable. There are limits to what we can confidently claim. It's tempting to draw a straight, clean line from a long-held grudge to specific biological outcomes, as if we could map every thought to a precise molecular change. That would make the story satisfying and easy to understand. But reality resists that kind of simplicity. Human biology is not a controlled experiment. You cannot isolate one variable, like a single emotional pattern, and hold everything else constant for 20 years. People differ in genetics, environment, diet, sleep, relationships, and countless other factors. These variables interact in ways that are not fully predictable. So when scientists study long-term stress and its effects, they are usually looking at patterns across groups, not precise cause and effect chains within individuals. This means we can say things like chronic stress is associated with changes in immune function, shifts in gene expression, and differences in health outcomes. But we cannot say this specific grudge caused this specific change in this exact way. There is a gap between what we can measure and what we experience. Another challenge is measurement itself. How do you quantify something like a grudge? It is not a single stable entity. It can vary in intensity, frequency, and emotional tone. Some days it may be almost absent. Other days it may feel vivid and immediate. Over years it may evolve, fade, or transform into something else entirely. From a scientific perspective, this makes it difficult to study directly. Researchers often rely on indirect measures, self-reported stress levels, physiological markers like hormone levels, or observable health outcomes. These are useful, but they are approximations. They capture parts of the system, not the whole. There is also the issue of interpretation. If two people show similar biological patterns, say elevated inflammation or altered stress responses, it does not mean those patterns came from the same source. One person's state might be influenced by work pressure, another's by early life experiences, another's by ongoing social conditions. A long-held grudge could be one contributing factor among many, but isolating its specific role is extremely difficult. Even at the level of gene expression and epigenetics, the system is dynamic. Chemical markers on DNA can change over time. Some may persist, others may fade. New patterns can emerge in response to new environments or behaviors. There is no simple, permanent imprint that can be traced back to a single psychological cause. This uncertainty is not a weakness of science. It is a reflection of the complexity of the system being studied. It also points to something deeper about how humans seek understanding. We tend to prefer clear, direct explanations. We want to know exactly what leads to what. We want to assign responsibility in a clean way. This caused that. But many of the most important processes in life do not follow that structure. They are distributed across time. They emerge from interactions. They depend on patterns rather than isolated events. A grudge, in this sense, is not a single cause. It is a pattern of mental and physiological activity that unfolds over time, interacting with many other patterns. What we can say with some confidence is that repeated activation of stress-related processes can influence the body in measurable ways. We can also say that mental patterns, when repeated often enough, can become part of those processes. What we cannot do is reduce the entire phenomenon to a simple equation. And perhaps that is the more honest position. Not that nothing is happening, and not that everything is determined, but that we are dealing with a system where small, repeated influences accumulate in ways that are real, but not easily traced. Understanding this requires a different kind of thinking, less about single causes, more about patterns over time. Instead of asking whether a grudge directly damages something inside you, it may be more useful to shift the question slightly and look at the system from a different angle. Rather than focusing on a single emotion or memory as a cause, you can think in terms of signals, continuous streams of activity moving through a living system. Your body is not waiting for big, dramatic events to decide how to behave. It is constantly sampling information, adjusting, recalibrating. Heart rate, hormone levels, immune activity, neural firing patterns. These are all changing moment to moment, even when you feel completely still. So a more precise question becomes, what kinds of signals are being repeated most often? If a particular memory is revisited again and again, it is not just being stored. It is being reactivated. Each time it returns, it carries with it a certain pattern, perhaps tension, perhaps anger, perhaps a sense of threat. That pattern is not abstract. It is implemented through physical processes, muscles tightening slightly, stress hormones rising a bit, attention narrowing in a particular way. Individually, these changes are small, but repetition gives them weight. If you imagine plotting these signals over time, they would not appear as a single spike. They would appear as a series of small pulses, scattered across days, months, years. The system responds not just to the size of each pulse, but to their frequency and persistence. At some point, the distinction between temporary reaction and background state begins to blur. What was once an occasional response can become part of the baseline. Not because the body makes a conscious decision, but because it adapts to what it experiences most frequently. Biological systems are efficient in that way. They tune themselves to the environments they encounter, even if that environment is partly generated from within. This leads to an unusual idea: the past, in a strict sense, does not continue to exist. The original event that created the grudge is over. It occupies a position in time that cannot be revisited physically. And yet, through repeated recall, something of it is recreated, not the event itself, but the pattern associated with it. In this way, the body is not responding to the past directly. It is responding to present moment signals that resemble the past. The distinction is subtle but important. From a biological perspective, there is only the current pattern of activity. Whether that pattern was triggered by something happening now or something remembered from long ago is secondary. This helps explain why internal experiences can have external-like effects. If you imagine two scenarios, one where a person is facing a real, immediate challenge, and another where they are vividly recalling a similar challenge, the body may respond in overlapping ways. Not identically, but with enough similarity that the difference is not absolute. Over long periods, this means that internally generated signals can contribute to the overall environment the body is adapting to. The environment is not just the air you breathe or the food you eat. It is also the patterns of activation that repeat within you. And because these patterns can persist without any external trigger, they can continue influencing the system long after the original cause has disappeared. This does not mean the system is trapped. Adaptation works in both directions. Just as repeated stress signals can shape the system, different patterns can also reshape it over time. The same mechanisms that allow persistence also allow change, but the key insight remains: the body does not track the story behind a signal. It does not label it as justified or unjustified, past or present. It responds to what is there, moment by moment. So when a pattern repeats often enough, it becomes part of what is there, not as a memory in the abstract sense, but as an ongoing influence within a complex, responsive system. At some point, the discussion stops being about a specific emotion and starts becoming about something more general. How a system carries its own history forward, not in the sense of remembering events the way a mind does, but in the sense of being shaped by everything that has happened repeatedly. If you look at any complex system, whether it's a river carving through land, a machine wearing down over time, or a living organism adapting to its environment, you see the same pattern. The present state of the system is not just the result of what is happening now. It is the accumulation of countless prior interactions layered on top of each other. In physics, this idea appears in many forms. Systems evolve over time based on initial conditions and ongoing inputs. Small influences, if persistent, can redirect trajectories. Once a path has been established, it tends to reinforce itself unless something interrupts it. In biology, the same principle operates, but with more complexity. Your body is not a static object. It is a continuous process, cells dividing, proteins forming, signals moving, structures being maintained and repaired. At every moment, it is integrating information from the past and the present to decide how to function. So when a certain pattern, like a recurring stress response, happens over and over, it becomes part of that integrated history, not as a single mark or a clear signature, but as a tendency, a bias, a slight leaning of the system in one direction rather than another. This is why it can be misleading to think in terms of damage alone. Damage suggests something broken, something clearly identifiable and separate from normal function. But many of the effects we're talking about are not like that. They are shifts within normal function, changes in how systems regulate themselves, how strongly they respond, how quickly they recover. From the outside, these shifts might not be obvious. A person can appear completely functional, healthy and stable. There may be no visible sign of anything unusual, and yet internally, certain processes may be running at slightly different settings than they otherwise would. These differences can matter over long timescales, not in a dramatic, immediate way, but in how the system handles challenges, repairs itself, and maintains balance. What makes this even more subtle is that the system does not separate internal and external causes in the way we do conceptually. Whether a signal originates from a physical event in the environment or from a pattern of neural activity recalling that event, it enters the same networks, influences the same pathways, and contributes to the same ongoing processes. From the body's perspective, there is only input. And from that input, there is response. Over time, repeated inputs shape the structure of those responses. They influence which pathways are used more often, which become more efficient, which fade into the background. This creates a kind of continuity between past and present that does not rely on conscious memory. Even if you stop actively thinking about a particular event, the patterns it helped establish may persist in subtle ways: how quickly you react, how your body prepares for certain situations, how easily certain emotional states are triggered. This is not deterministic. It does not lock a person into a fixed outcome, but it does mean that history, when repeated often enough, becomes part of the system's current configuration, not as a story, but as a structure. And that structure, in turn, influences what the system is likely to do next, creating a loop where past patterns continue to shape future behavior without needing to be consciously recalled. So the question is no longer just about what a grudge does over time. It becomes a broader question about how any repeated pattern, mental or physical, gradually becomes embedded in the way a system operates, and once embedded, how it quietly guides the direction of everything that follows.